Yeah. All right. I think we are on. So thanks so much, Simon and Julian, for doing this. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about this. This was more it started off as more a personal exploration, but then I thought, I mean, I clearly didn't know anything about this other than what I'd read, and what I'd read was very sparse. So I'm, of course, talking about the rapid risk assessment, methodology that I don't know whether you call it a methodology or a practice or whatever you call it internally, but this was a large focus of my, a research effort that I've been trying to put in, understanding different ways in which people threat model. So let me give you a little bit of a backstory and then kind of open the floor to some of the questions I have, and of course, more freewheeling discussion should you want it that way. So I have been kind of engaged in threat modeling for a while now, in the sense about last 2 3 years. I think my interest in threat modeling has definitely taken an upswing. And I really like to work at the intersection of threat modeling and automation, which is essentially what you would typically hear of as DevSecOps. I really like that piece, especially where I believe that threat modeling can be used very well if you do it well in the entire cycle, rather than just as a theoretical activity that in many cases it's kind of reduced to. So as a result of that, we actually built an open source project called Threat Playbook, and it's still, I mean, it's used in a few places, but I wanted to see what else is out there, what else are people doing, and how they are trying to do this, especially organizations doing it at scale, or even if it's not at scale for siloed teams or smaller teams, how are they achieving threat modeling? So I came across, of course, the RRA, or the Rapid Risk Assessment. I read a little bit about it, but I still did not fully grasp how it works and how do you do it. How has it started? So if you could kind of fill us in a little bit more on that, that would be great.
Sure. I mean, I can give a little bit of the history of how we started this process. So I think it was about 7 years ago that Guillaume Destender and myself were working in the operations security team of Mozilla, and we were trying to triage a large number of web applications by risk level.
Okay.
And we're trying to figure out, which web application we cared about in the event of an incident or disaster recovery in priority compared to all of the stuff we had to maintain. And it became pretty clear that we couldn't apply a traditional risk assessment method because they take weeks to run through, right? I have a formal background in risk assessment. The way you typically do this in a bank, it takes you a month and a half. And it's very thorough, very exhaustive, but you can't run it across like 100 applications quickly. And so we just took the pieces that made sense, the CIA triad, and actually trying to have a basic scale of quantifying impact by financial risk and by reputation and by productivity and all of that stuff, and just making a basic matrix of the risk level of an application and running all of our applications through that to get a first list of what we actually cared about. And it turned out that the data we ended up with was interesting, but what was even more interesting was that having those conversations with the operators and the developers was very, very productive. Right? They actually liked having a risk conversation. They liked having that interaction with us and actually digging into how things could fail and what it could cause. And we realized that even more so than a quantifying tool, than a risk quantifying tool, this was a communication tool, something we could use at the beginning of projects to have a conversation with the developers, with the operators, and asking them very simply, how do you think this could fail, and what do you think this could cause to the infrastructure? And so this turned more into, so the rapid risk assessment turned more into a threat modeling exercise, where instead of trying to run it through a formal risk assessment method, like you would do if you're at NASA and trying to send a satellite, in orbit, and you have to do something extremely thorough, we turn this more into a casual conversation with the devs and make it part of the process where as they are building something new, we ask them to think about the ways this could fail, or this could get abused, or this could get attacked. And it turns out they love doing that. They actually love thinking through the failure scenarios. And so we record that, and we try to rather than fit that discussion into a strict canvas, we try to leave it fairly open-ended. We try to turn it more into a conversation and try to feed various failure scenario into the conversation. One that Guillaume always loved to use, and I use pretty often too, is what would happen if your database ended up being published on Twitter? And you can see the wheels turning in the developers' heads as they think through that. It's like, well, hold on, let me think through the schema. Is there anything I worry about? Could this be abused to put users at risk, et cetera, et cetera? And so we do that all the time now in the rapid risk assessment. And we use it more as a way to shape the design of application to reduce the inherent risk of that application than as a way to really categorize a risk. Although, with that said, we found that even if the data is often messy, because you can't really take two applications and compare them exactly, correct? Because the scope will be different from a risk assessment to another. We're starting to find ways to really collect all of that data and aggregate it and rank it, so we can then prioritize our security work based on what we found during the RRAs. And it also allows us to go revisit older applications that are 2, 3, 4, 5 years old and go see if the risks still exist. Go back to the developer and say, hey, 2 years ago you said this could be an issue. Did it turn out to be an issue or not? If it did, we can revisit it. And we also feed that into the future RRAs to make them more realistic, right? That's a bit of a background, like how we use this internally at a very, very high level.
That's very interesting, because what I read about it was that you actually quickly 30 or maximum 60 minutes. That was something I saw, especially written out in your, and you even have a breakdown of the timing. I was quite surprised by that. You have like 1 minute for like, scope discussion, and then 5 minutes for, kind of putting together a problem, and then you have 10 minutes for, so how does that work? Especially because obviously it's not going to be that simple to kind of just lay out a service in 30 minutes. So how do you kind of achieve that time boxing? What has, and is that like a agile sprint process, or is that like a one-time process? How does that typically work?
Well, I would say that, I mean, the times in the document are just suggestions. So give you an idea of how it breaks down. I think everyone kind of runs RRAs in their own particular way. So you tend to, I tend to try and go with the flow. You want to make sure that developers and operations staff are kind of thinking about these things and talking about things. And sometimes you'll go off on, down off tangents, and some of those aren't so interesting. You say, okay, well, that's interesting, let's come back. And sometimes you suddenly open up a whole can of worms, and that's exactly and you don't want to cut the conversation short at that point. So it kind of varies. But I think, it's definitely a way of helping us communicate. And it's not just between the development teams and operations staff, but even amongst the security teams. So we don't want to overload it with the whole security team there. There'll only usually be 1 or 2 of us. But then we write up the RA, and whoever led it will then present it at our weekly meetings. And so everyone else in the security team gets to learn about what's going on, and then throw in suggestions, say, well, wait a minute, doesn't that interact with that? Did you go into this? What about this? So it's, it helps us learn what's going on across the organization, and allows other people to throw in suggestions. I remember there was a time when, and you can, dive into things and realize you've got to go back and find out more information.
Right.
Yeah, so, typically what happens in a lot of RRAs is that the first half is a discovery phase. You end up trying to understand. So it all depends if you have a prior history with the team building the application, if you already know the context of the application, or if it's something completely new, right? But usually for like, say, a fairly beefy new web application that will have a few APIs and a front end with users interacting, it will take us probably an hour to go through the thing. And the first 30 minutes are going to be spent understanding how it is built, what technologies are they using on the front end and back end and database, and where is it going to be hosted, and etc. And then we go through the data dictionary to understand what data is going to be stored, and is any of this data sensitive, and etc. etc. At this point in our maturity, we effectively host most of our web application using the standard paved road that the operations team provides, and so it simplifies a lot of the RRA work that we used to do even 3 or 4 years ago. Like now we have checklists, so we just say, if you're building an application like this, just follow the checklist and it will tell you all of the standard headers, all of the standard logging mechanism, and et cetera, that you need to use. 4 years ago, we had to re-explain all of that during the RA, and it took a lot of time, right? We have to explain to people how to host it properly and what to watch out for. All of that is standardized now. So we can spend a lot more time actually focusing on like business logic, right? And spend less time on the boilerplate. But the first half is usually spent on like understanding what the application does, and some are easy. It's just an API, it does a few things. And some, like typically when we get into like OAuth type integrations and you have flows and callbacks and all sorts of things, like wrapping your head around the mess of requests and what they contain and etc. can take a little bit of time. And so it's really important we understand that well, so we can make recommendations in the like CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability section of the document, which is really the meat of the RRA process.
Right. That's thanks both of you for that. From what I've been seeing, at least the kind of threat modeling that I've been doing and seeing some success with is the story-driven approach, where we start off with a story. So especially with teams that are doing it in an agile sprint, start off with a story, have a user story, break down that by abuse. So write an abuser story or write a bunch of abuser story, and then break it down to a technical threat, and then segue that into mitigations and maybe checklists, questionnaires, however you want to structure that. Is this from what I understand, this seems like this doesn't seem to be that story driven kind of approach. So when you want to do this in an agile, for an agile team to do this, how would they take it? How would they start? How would they apply an RRA for themselves? What would their sprint look like, or what would their entire overall process? Is this more overall, or is this more micro from their perspective?
Good question. I mean, I think we treat the RRA as usually it's kind of a one-off. So it's something that would happen early on. We do revisit RRAs, but they, that'll be after several years, or if there's something significant changing. I think the important thing is the RRA was typically the start of our engagement with a particular project. So just because we've done the RRA, that doesn't mean that's where our interactions end. That's just where they start. So there'll be findings that come out of the RRA, and some of those could be, they could be quite minor things, or they could be, okay, we need a full security review of the code here. We want to get an external pen test of these things. So that it can be, it's a discovery phase. It's getting the dialogue going, but it's going, okay, we now know we need to know a lot more about this particular aspect, or we might decide we actually need RRAs on different aspects of the, if it's a new big service, then it's like, okay, we're going to have a long ongoing engagement. So it's really difficult to say, to compare a small project, which is just throwing up a quick website, and, we'll have websites with informational only. There's all public data, no interaction. Those are easy, and then you compared with, really big sites which interact with which have a lot of private data, interact with a lot of services, our services, external services, those are much more complex. So, it's very much, that's just the start of the process, and there'll be a lot more security and work involved.
Right. Absolutely. That's great. Thanks for that. I think I get a much clearer perspective. When it comes to, so one thing that I heard in the previous response that both of you gave me was that now a lot of it has baselined, you have a lot of baselines for like the boilerplate stuff like, let's say CSP or, cross-site scripting, SQL injection prevention. This kind of stuff you can baseline because you do have you can eliminate entire classes of flaws with certain checklists or with an API or with your own variant of whatever secure API that you're using. So have you seen that the time taken for threat modeling at large, has it gone down, in the sense that when I say time taken may not be time taken, you may also look at it as effort taken. Do you see that over time it actually goes down? Has it engendered better security engineering within Mozilla's teams because of this?
It doesn't go down. In fact, it's the opposite. It goes up. And I'll tell you why. The
Okay.
developers love it. And
Okay.
so I've had teams actually come to us
Mm-hmm.
with a project, and the project manager tell us, everyone gets excited when it's time to do the RRA, because it's a fun process.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually is a 1 hour meeting where you get to brainstorm ways to blow things up, and it actually is enjoyable. And so as a result of that, it's not like I've run risk assessments in large organizations where it was a chore. Like everybody hated it and nobody wanted to do it, and somebody was assigned to do it, and they were like, this is going to be a pain in the ass. The RA isn't that. The RA is an enjoyable conversation, and it needs to be fruitful. And when it's done well, the organization actually adopts it as one of its product design mechanism, right? It's one of the way you build good quality applications, good quality products, because you spend a bunch of time thinking about how it could be abused. And we found that teams that adopt it well, and have a lot of maturity in it. I'm thinking about, for example, the team that runs Firefox accounts. That product has been around for years and years, and we've done I can't even, like, probably 30 or 40 RAs with that team. They're really good at it. We do an RA with FX. It's super easy because everybody's engaged. They already know what the process is going to be about. They already started thinking about the threats, and so it's a very fruitful conversation, right? Because you don't need to re-explain the process, and there's a bit of apprehension when a new group starts doing an RA. They're like, what is a security process? So you need to kind of break the ice when you first engage with a team. But if you're past that point, it becomes very fruitful. So we end up doing more of it, and we end up actually going much deeper into the type of issues we address. Right? Like you say, we don't talk about CSP anymore. I think 85% of our production sites have CSP in place. This is not something we have to sell. It's a given. Like, just do it and be done with it. Right? We don't have to re-explain those threats, but instead we can think about, how an advanced motivated attacker would, abuse the service to do X, Y, and Z, and what we could do on our side to make it more difficult or prevent it or detect it, et cetera, which is a lot more interesting to do.
Right.
I think it's also a case that security controls don't really get rid of threats. They get rid of particular types of vulnerabilities. So we can prevent SQL injection, we can prevent cross-site scripting, but the threat actors are still the same. And they want to attack the services. And we are trying to make sure it's as hard for them as possible. If you've got these good security controls, good baseline in place, then it'll be much harder for the threat actors to actually do anything. But they're still out there, and they're still going to try. They're just going to have to try harder. So we do get into we're not looking at what happens if they find SQL injection. With what happens if they do find a vulnerability in the application or in the operating system or in the operating system, the operations environment. What could they do? We don't care about how they managed to get access to the database. It's if an attacker got access to the database, how bad would it be? It's those kind of discussions we have, and then our job is to make sure and not. This isn't the job of the security team. It's the job of the operations and developers and security team together to make sure we have the application, the environment in place that makes it, that mitigates as many of these threats as much as possible.
I think that's a very important point that Simon's making now, is that the point of the RRA isn't to discuss the baseline at all, right? The point of the RRA is for the developers to think about their application and things they might want to change or design differently to make the end product more secure, right? It's a design tool. So, for example, if an application collects a piece of information that is extremely sensitive, but in fact doesn't really need that piece of information to do its job, then maybe the application can be designed differently. And the point of the RRA is to bring that awareness to the dev team so that they can think about doing it differently before it's too late, right? And the most fruitful RRAs really are the ones where we end up with a product that is just a little bit different, where we do things a little bit differently than initially planned, and that reduces the risk tremendously. It's not interesting to do an RRA to realize that, yes, in fact, you need CSP or HSTS. Like that's not the point at all, right? It's interesting to do an RRA when you realize that they were planning to collect a bunch of data they don't need, and in fact, they can do the exact same thing without all that data, and then suddenly you don't have to worry, and you go from an app that's high risk to an app that's low risk, and you can even tell them to go self-host in Heroku, right? So that's really the interesting end results that we're looking for.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, I think I get. That was a very interesting point. One thing that was part of your previous response, which was interesting to me, and this is always a bugbear for a lot of teams, is this whole breaking the ice. Because in a lot of companies, security is a natural adversary to engineering teams or product management teams. So my question is kind of twofold. One, what do you do to break the ice? And two, what kind of an RRA meeting setup, or the kind of folks who are involved, what do you do to make this process one, a little bit more involved, inclusive of everybody? Two, also to make sure that a lot of these people, remember, they are naturally adversarial relationships like QA and engineering, or security and engineering. So they see themselves at least a little adversarially. So they might start to also, throw their blame around a little bit. I've seen that a lot happening in threat modeling meetings, where people openly go ahead and blame the other person for something. So these things, how do you handle it? How do you break the ice? And of course, how do you continue getting folks to buy into this over time? What kind of constitution should you have in terms of the meetings and stuff?
The first, so if we take this from the perspective of someone creating like a new security initiative in an organization that doesn't have a good culture, the way I like to approach it is to focus on one area, one team, one group, make them a partner, show that you're here to help, and then use that group as an example to expand your influence, right? So don't try to take everything at once and do a shitty job. Just focus on one particular area, do a good job there, and then go to another team and say, hey, I just helped, these people over here. I'd like to help you as well, and gain, the other aspect, particular to the RRA process, is people are naturally lazy, which is a good thing. So if you provide ways to reduce their workload or have less things to worry about, and you frame it, this way, they will be more willing to adopt it. And that's a lot of what we do in the RA process, is like, hey, you could do all these things, but this is going to be super hard to implement and maintain and do, or you could simplify it and everybody's happier. And there's always someone who's interested in simplifying, whether it's the operations team running it or the dev team implementing it or the product manager, etc. So try to find the angle that speaks to the team. And it actually, actually drives adoption of the security effort. And often it's reducing complexity that usually works well. Simon, if you have more tips.
I think an attitude, your attitude is very important, and how you express yourself and how you come across. And, we always try to make sure that it's clear we're all in this together. We're not adversarial. We are there to help them. We are there to help them build a secure product. And that is, we're not there to break their shit. We want to help them. We're helping that, we don't actually make things more secure. We help the developers to make it more secure, or the operations staff. So it's that kind of attitude, and making sure they realize we're all on the same side.
Right. Great. Thanks. Now both of you are quite steeped in DevOps in different ways. Simon with Zap, probably the most API, the most friendly API to use in the Dask world. And of course, Julian, who's an author, and as well as, of course, implemented DevOps at scale from a security perspective as well. So, how does RRA help DevOps in the sense that have you seen, first of all, again, it's a two-part question. How does it help? And has it helped? Do you have like concrete examples of where it has influenced your automation strategy in some way, shape, or form? So just curious to understand that, because so far RRA is, yes, it's more a pre-mortem kind of thing where you think of things blowing up and then figure out how you're going to address them, and address them in multiple ways. It could be through a design change, it could be through reducing the risk itself, it could be through engaging pen testing, whatever. But how would you say that it has influenced automation, especially because automation is on everybody's lips today?
I think I mean, whether it's directly the RRA or not, I'm not sure. But when we talked about having standard ways of doing these things and standard security tools, one of the things we were very concerned as a security team is we're asking people to put all these things in place, but we don't. At one stage we didn't know they were in place. We wanted to, and something might be put in place and then they might break, it might be changed, or things change over time. So we wanted to make sure that we could actually measure how well we were doing as much as possible. So that is where there's that baseline scan came out of, and quite a few, we've got a lot of automation tools, which not just that, we deal with looking at cloud configuration and a whole load of stuff to do, permissions on cloud services, GitHub and the like. So we try to measure everything we possibly can, all automated, and then we feed that into our dashboards. So we got dashboards which show how well we're doing particular things, and then we'll typically have objectives around those. So one of mine was to get HSTS up to a certain, up to 80% on our production sites. So we have those kind of objectives. So I think that's that's the kind of, we know that we can't measure everything, but it gives us an idea of what's actually going on and how well, and whether we're making impact or not.
Right, absolutely.
And add to this, the RA process itself really does nothing for your automation, but your automation really does nothing for your security if people are not fixing things.
Right.
And that's where the RA comes into play, because I see a lot of people conflating DevSecOps with automation. Automation is a subtopic of DevSecOps. The bigger issue that a lot of security teams ignore is you need a culture. And the origins of DevOps wasn't so much about tooling. It was more about getting developer and ops to work together, right? Closer, so that applications can be deployed and operations adopt the techniques of developers so they can collaborate better. DevSecOps the same way. So you need to get those people closer together, to get them to speak the same language, to share the same successes and failures, et cetera, et cetera. That needs to be a cohesive group of people. And what we found is that the RA is a really, really good communication channel to talk to dev teams regularly and build that culture, right? Explain to them what we care about. They explain to us how they build things and what is important to them, so we can align. And so when we get to the point where automation will trigger, or for example, like Simon said, we go to the dev teams and we say, hey, look, it's very important for us that we get HSTS everywhere. They understand why it's important to us because we've talked to them about these things in RAs, right? Or when automation automatically creates a bug to tell them that CSP had changed and is now non-compliant with our baseline on an application, they understand where it's coming from. So the RA is really the cultural glue around all of this automation and tooling and everything else that you do, right?
No, absolutely. I like that statement, the cultural glue. In fact, yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I keep saying, that DevSecOps is very little about automation, more about the people. The tools are really not the problem. It's the people that you need to get aligned. So I think that stands to reason with this process as well. One of the other things that I've constantly seen, especially with slightly outmoded threat modeling, is that you have a bunch of folks who do a threat model. They produce an amazing looking report, some great diagrams. Those reports are huge usually, and nobody ever reads them. Their outputs are never consumed by people who should be consuming them. So, what outputs does the RRA itself, kind of come up with directly or indirectly, and how do you consume these outputs in terms of? I understand that, of course, from the previous answer that Simon gave, some of the dashboards and stuff probably emerge, but how do you use it for different teams? You probably have red teams, blue teams, developers. You have a combination of folks. How do different people use the RRA within Mozilla?
So the most important artifact to get out of an RRA is a list of recommendations. And those recommendations typically go into like issue tracking for the product itself, right? So we'll create GitHub issues, Jira ticket, Bugzilla bugs, whatever the product team uses to track, changing an API code to this because that came up during the RA that we should do it this way. That's the first artifact. So it needs to go straight into the product roadmap. The second artifact we get is the RA document itself. So nowadays, when I wrote the book, we were still on the spreadsheet version of the RA. Now we use a Google Doc version of the RA that is more readable, that is just like 3 or 4 pages long, but it's easier to go through. And that document itself is something we often refer to like later on, or even use it as a communication tool with other groups. When they want to know if we've done the security due diligence, we share that document with them. But it's not 30 pages long. Like it's really like you can read it in 30 seconds. You can browse it and read it after 30 seconds and get an idea of the security posture of the product. And then we have a little bit of automation, but we don't make heavy use of it right now. We often like copy like the risk level of the application into an inventory we have on the side, but that's a manual. There's no automation there. But we're starting to look at ways to we have automated ways to parse the Google Doc and extract like the risk level and the data security levels and the list of recommendations into spreadsheets, but we don't really make use of it now. We're starting to figure out how we can tie the output of the RAs with the rest of our automation and metrics and our service inventory to like put a cohesive view of this is how a service is doing. But it's still a little way off. I think we still need probably like 6 months to a year of work to get there.
Okay.
I think it's also, I think the recommendations are the key part. And the important thing to realize is that we have all the key people there. We have the operational staff, we have the developers. And so the process of understanding this, we're threat modeling together, and our developers come up with some great threat. Well, they've usually thought about these things if they've gone through this process before, and we'll bounce ideas around. So the people who need to consume the threat model are in the meeting and are consuming it there and then. And what will often happen is those recommendations are, we'll bounce around ideas, come up with what could go wrong, come up with suggestions, particularly if it adding security controls or removing things or doing things a different way. And then those go into the recommendations. So it's a very tight turnaround. We do the threat modeling, we probably come up with a set of solutions, and then we assign the bugs for them. So it's not, you don't have a separate team doing a 30-page report and handing it over to developers who then don't read it. Everyone's in there. We're going through it very quickly. It's like, right, it should be done this way. Okay, that's bug number whatever. Move on. And so I think the whole process is being actually in the meeting is an important aspect of it, and a lot of people get a lot out of that.
Right. And actually, since we're on the topic of publishing 30-page reports, this is a pet peeve of mine. If you're a security firm and all you produce as an artifact is a 30-page report and you don't offer to file bugs or issues into your customer issue tracking system, I will not hire you. This is very, very simple. Go file the freaking bugs. I just paid you 50 grand to do an audit. You can file bugs for me. I'm not manually parsing a PDF document to go file bugs. This is nonsense. So there are teams that actually do this really well, and they understand that issue tracking is really the heart of a dev team, of project managers. It's very important to integrate into that. Don't go create separate unparsable documents on the side. That's nonsense.
Absolutely. So yeah, thanks so much. I think I mean those are all the questions I had. I just thought this would help understand this a little bit better, especially RRA. I did have a lot of gray areas before this, but I think I understand it a little bit better now. And yeah, I'm going to try and see how I can incorporate that in the open source project I was talking about, and also in when I talk to people and say that how can they use something like this, especially within their own organization. Obviously, I'm sure there's much more to figure out, but I really appreciate both of you taking this time to have this conversation. I know it's particularly busy, and people working from home, it's probably busier at this time than anything else for some reason. I don't know why that is, but it just happens that we somehow seem to be much busier than we were pre-COVID. So just one of those things, I guess. Thank you
I
so
think
much.
one thing
Yeah,
I would
sorry.
would add is that the RRE process is something we've developed over a period of time and works for Mozilla. It
Mhm.
won't necessarily work as it stands if in the same way other organizations.
Yeah,
So you can use it as a basic, but make sure you tune it to what works for you. I
yeah,
think that's we've got some very experienced developers and operational staff. So Mozilla has quite a high level of maturity in case of security. If you're a very different profile organization, change
mhm.
play around with it, work out what works for you, and do it that, and change it to work however works best.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. You can't just force fit this into your organization or your process or your team. So, absolutely. I'm just going to stop recording now, and yeah, we can wind up.